wanted to talk to you a little bit about the biography of Niccolo Machiavelli, so that will give you the historical context to better understand what you're going to read about the prince. In the late 1490s, Florence had been taken over by Savonarola, the charismatic, populist, fundamentalist, a little bit crazy priest, monk, who had expelled the Medici and was sort of forcing new sort of morality on the city. Eventually, he comes up in conflict with the Borgia Pope, Alexander VI, who is able to have Savonarola arrested and tortured and executed. After this, Florence becomes a republic under the leadership of a man named Piero Soderini, and Machiavelli is in the government. He's only 29 when this happens in 1498, and he's going to be involved in public policy, for example, trying to create Florentine military so that Florence wouldn't have to rely on mercenaries, which is the way the Italian city-states operated at this time. And he's sending out on diplomatic missions. He's going to go to the court of France, meet the French king, Louis XII, and there he's impressed, maybe somewhat appalled, to see how strong the French are, and to realize Florence is not going to be able to stand up against them militarily. He's also going to go and be on a diplomatic mission to Cesare Borgia, the son of the Borgia Pope, who is the military leader of the papal armies. He's going to observe how Borgia forces the papal states and other communities into submission and governs them. Italy at this time has become the battleground for other countries fighting it out. So there will be French armies that come in, Spanish armies that come in. A little bit later, we're going to have the armies of the Holy Roman Emperor. And the Italian city-states are really not capable of holding their own. Eventually, in 1512, the Medici come back to Florence and come into power, and Machiavelli is arrested and he's tortured, being accused of plotting against the Medici. He's tied up with his arms behind his back, and after this torture, where he doesn't confess to anything, he's exiled from Florence, and he's going to go to his small estate that he owns in a small town outside Florence, and going to be in exile there, trying to get back into the favor of the Medici. And while he's there, he's going to write two works simultaneously, and I think that's important to understand. In 1513, he's going to write The Prince, which is a short book, and he's also starting, and will spend several years, writing discourses on Livy, the Roman writer Livy, and he's really interested in the Roman Republic and how it survived for so long. And he's going to write that Aristotle's view of the various types of government are all pernicious, they cannot survive, they all lead to something bad. And eventually a monarchy becomes tyranny, aristocracy becomes an oligarchy, and democracies descend into anarchy. And what he wants is more of a composite government that will be a republic. And that's his real goal, is to have a republic. He feels that a republic is the optimal form of government, that the people will make wiser decisions together than any set of leaders might, and it's also more flexible and can change with the times. And so he wants a republic. That's his goal. But he realizes that for Florence to be strong enough to stand up against its enemies, it's going to need a strong ruler who will be strong enough to protect Florence and eventually help Florence transform itself into being a republic. You can think about a famous quote from 18th century French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who wrote that The Prince is a handbook for republicans disguised as a manual for tyrants. Or maybe it's reverse. So while he's there in this small community, in 1513, he's working on The Prince, and he writes a letter to a good friend of his describing his day. And as I'm going to read you excerpts from this letter, picture Machiavelli living this life, and then as he describes being in his study, think about how you are when you do homework, and maybe you can think of emulating Machiavelli. So he talks about an ordinary day. I shall tell you about my life. I get up in the morning with the sun and go into one of my woods that I'm having cut down. There I spend a couple hours inspecting the work of the previous day and kill some time with the woodsmen, who always have some dispute on their hands, either among themselves or with their neighbors. And then he goes on and describes some of his neighbors. These are all lower class, not educated people that he's describing. He talks about going to the inn and eating and drinking with them and listening to their squabbles. And he says, thus, having been cooped up among these lice, those are his neighbors, I get the mold out of my brain and let out the malice of my fate, content to be ridden over roughshod in this fashion, if only to discover whether or not my fate is ashamed of treating me so. When evening comes, I return home and enter my study. On the threshold I take off my workday clothes, covered with mud and dirt, and put on the garments of court and palace. Fitted out appropriately, I step inside the venerable courts of the ancients, where, solicitously received by them, I nourish myself on that food that alone is mine and for which I was born, where I am unashamed to converse with them and to question them about the motives for their actions, and they, out of their human kindness, answer me. And for 4 hours at a time I feel no boredom, I forget all my troubles, I do not dread poverty, and I am not terrified by death. I absorb myself into them completely, and because Dante says that no one understands anything unless he retains what he has understood, I've jotted down what I've profited from in their conversation, and composed a short study, De Principatibus, in which I delve as deeply as I can into the ideas concerning this topic, discussing the definition of a princedom, the categories of princedom, how they are acquired, how they are retained, and why they are lost. And this is the work that is going to become The Prince. And he's going to write it. He tries to submit it to the leading Medici of the time. That doesn't go all so well. He eventually gets a small job to write the history of Florence, and that's what he's going to live off of writing later. Here's a picture of Borgia, and here's a picture for him in Florence. There are two concepts that he talks about in the last excerpt I'm giving you to read, which is the second to last chapter of The Prince, where he talks about virtu and fortuna. Virtu is not virtue. It comes from the Latin word for man. So think of it more like manliness. This is the same root like the word virile that you might know. And it means manliness, prowess, decisiveness, taking action. And that's what he feels a good leader needs. And then he talks about fortuna, which is a feminine word, and so he imagines Fortuna as a woman. And for them, he's talking about Fortuna is fate. And it is not something that can really be changed unless you're prepared for it. And so what he's hoping is that a successful prince will have been able to have studied various governments, known what they have, and can be prepared for when fate is going to impact his life, and by knowing the things that he's writing about in The Prince and Discourses on Living, a good leader, a good man can be prepared and take action. And so that's why he's writing